Welcome to our webinar, The CFO Journey, How to Use Economic Intelligence to Maximize Shareholder Value, brought to you by Argyle, the publisher of CFO Magazine and CFO.com, and brought to you with support from the sponsor of our webinar, Prevedere. I'm Joe Fleischer, and I'll be your moderator. And before we begin, I would like to cover a few features of the console that attendees are viewing. I would first note for attendees on the left side of your console, you will be able to view slides and respond to polls during the course of our webinar. From the resources list area of your console, you will be able to click on a link to download a PDF document comprising slides from our webinar. You'll also be able to click on links to view information about upcoming events that offer the opportunity to hear from and meet finance leaders in person. Now, although we will plan to dedicate the latter portion of our webinar to addressing your questions, we do invite you to type in your questions and comments at any time during the course of our webinar in the Q&A area of your console. Those who join our live webinar have the opportunity to earn a certificate representing one continuing professional education or CPE credit. To be eligible, we ask that you respond to all three polling questions we'll intersperse throughout our webinar. To respond to a polling question when it appears, we ask that you select the radio button that reflects your answer, then click on the submit button so that we can record your response. Now, after we've posed our last, in this case, our third polling question during the course of our live webinar, if you have answered all three polling questions and are therefore eligible to receive credit, you will be able to click on an icon within your console to download the certificate, and that'll be located in the certification section of your console. If you have answered all three polling questions but are not able to retrieve your certificate, you will be able to do so when this webinar is available in the past webinar section later this week on CFO.com. I am thrilled to let you know about our distinguished guests. Joining us today is Victor Casalino, CFO Americas with Global Sales, Marketing, and Operations area of Microsoft, and Rich Wagner, Founder and Chief Executive Officer with the sponsor of our webinar, Prevedere. Some quick background is in order. Victor Casalino, I mentioned, is CFO for the Americas region at Microsoft. In this capacity, Victor leads the finance function for the United States, Latin America, and Canada regions, provides finance and strategic leadership for the most dynamic and largest geography for Microsoft, including deep business partnership and insight, allocation and prioritization of sales and technical resources, and compliance and digital transformation and finance. And joining Victor is, as I mentioned, Rich Wagner, Founder and Chief Executive Officer with Prevedere. Rich has more than 15 years of leadership experience with Big Four consulting and Fortune 500 companies. He's worked with C-level executives on major corporate initiatives that include preparing due diligence on dozens of multi-billion-dollar mergers, acquisitions, and corporate projects, and Rich's experience and expertise encompass a variety of industries, including manufacturing, consumer goods, and retail. Indeed, at this stage, it is now my pleasure to turn the floor over to Rich and to Victor. Please give a warm welcome to them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe. I appreciate the introduction and glad to have everyone on the call this morning. I will go over an outline of what we'll be talking about through this webinar, and then we'll be engaging Victor throughout the webinar to get some of his experience from the largest or one of the largest technology companies in the world. So thank you again, everyone. First, we'll start with something that resonates a lot with our audience, hopefully, is challenges confronting today's CFOs. There we'll talk about what we are hearing from our enterprise customers here at Prevedere, and then I'll turn that over to Victor and ask some questions on his experience and his current challenges that he is facing. Secondly, we'll dive deep into one of those topics, and that's about how the economy and the changing global economy is impacting CFOs in ways that CFOs can leverage economic intelligence and technology such as AI or machine learning to be able to combat those problems or those issues. Third, we'll talk about how CFOs can start becoming more data-driven in the organization, leveraging this technology, and some of the results once they have. Next, we'll talk about the future, how the CFO is going to turn into more of a growth enabler for enterprise organizations going forward. And then finally, we'll have questions and answers at the end. So the first thing we want to talk about is one of the challenges that we've seen in the audience, one of the challenges that we've seen as a company that serves many enterprise customers across the globe in dozens of different industries. And what we've noticed is in today's world, one thing holds true. The world's changing faster and with more volatility than ever before. what that does is it puts a lot of pressure on CFOs in organizations that we talk to because they have to keep up with the pace of that change. And one thing that resonates very well with our audience is we've all been in this meeting. We've all been in a board meeting, could be a leadership meeting where we're trying to plan for annual or quarterly forecast, and we're trying to answer what happened to our business. Maybe there was a change in a certain market or a certain region that was unexpected. That also creates the problem that we're not as confident about our forward-looking forecast and where the business is heading. So these meetings happen all day and every day, and we know that the problem is getting worse. Each day we'll have news from different organizations pointing out to economic conditions and changing in different countries. It could be political issues that cause some concern amongst consumers. There could also be events such as weather pattern changes that are impacting our business more frequently. Or it could be a virus, as we're hearing in China, that may affect the travel industry in North America and China this year. All those things are out there, and we've got to do something as a leader within the organization to try and understand those and try to act ahead of those changes. And with that, I do want to ask Victor if any of that one resonates with him and the challenges that you face, Victor, and any other challenges that you think the modern CFO has in front of them today.
Well, thanks very much, Rich, and I'm very happy to be here. Really appreciate the invite. I think, yes, I mean, these are things that we have to live day to day. The way that I view the finance function, the main role that we play, the most strategic role that we play is resource allocation at the end of the day. And resource allocation is a key question. It requires a lot of courage and fortitude to move resources from one area of a company to the one that has the most potential, that has the most growth and the most profitability to any company, right? And to do that, you do require fidelity in how is that you perceive the world and what models and understanding not just your market, but the economics at play. I mean, if you think about Microsoft, for us, we had a very seminal and important decision, I want to say 8-9 years ago, when we decided to enter the cloud business with Azure. There was a speech that Steve Ballmer gave at UW, I think in 2012, if I recall correctly, right? In making that call implied having some foresight and insights as to the direction of of technology and customer needs. And so, yeah, it's super important for me to have information, availability of market data, being able to frame those issues in a way that you can interpret them and transmit them to your board or to your leadership team.
Great. No, that makes a lot of sense, Victor, and you touched on foresight and understanding a shifting consumer, for the cloud business, right, where we're seeing the adoption of cloud from enterprise companies that traditionally house their own equipment and applications, and having that vision and having that insight on the changing consumer obviously is proved very profitable and very successful. So that's great. And then thinking about that and being able to see the future and leverage maybe some external information, one thing that we know with large enterprise customers that are in mature markets or been around maybe a decade or more is actually the external factors that impact your business a lot of times are even more important than just your internal historical data or things that you're going to do internally, such as raise price or maybe enter or develop a new product. Those are definitely important. However, if there's no external demand, say in traditional data center build-outs, then really no matter what you do, people are going to shift to the cloud. And what Harvard Business Review and some studies that we've seen is that up to 85% of changes in demand and financial performance for large organizations is really out of their control. It's things that are happening in the consumer and the economics of the world, weather patterns, etc. And if you can actually harness that data, if we can look at both that internal, what we know, and our historical trends and what's selling and what's working, along with our price and promotion, and marry that with these external signals, we'll have a more holistic picture of where our business is heading. And it sounds like that is something that Microsoft has done very well in anticipating market changes, anticipating changes in consumers, most likely spend in corporations to lift and shift things to the cloud, have all paid off for them. So what's interesting in a survey we did, certainly, Victor, go ahead.
No, I was just going to make a quick comment. I mean, I think the challenge that all companies, all corporations, the small, medium, large enterprises, I mean, the biggest challenge that we have in front of us is how can we grow beyond the secular growth of a country or an economy, right? You have economies developed economies growing 4 or 5%, 3%, that would be fantastic numbers. And yet we know that that's not enough to have a successful enterprise. How do you sustain companies that are worth billions of dollars in revenue growing at double digit or more? And so for that, you require, I think, a couple of things. I mean, first, the imagination of seeing the potential, and that usually, I do agree wholeheartedly, it requires a proper assessment of the market conditions, the economy, the needs of customers, so external data, as you call it. And second, it also requires the fortitude to manage your own sales force, right? There is a pathology to forecasting where anytime you are above budget, things look gloomy in the future. People become pessimistic and, no, we're going to come down to budget. And if you're below budget, you all of a sudden become very optimistic and you think things are going to get better. And even though we are behind now, we're going to get back to budget sometime in the near future. And so it is these two forces that I think successful finance functions have been able to manage in order to steer the company towards allocating resources in the right places, putting pressure where we need, so that we can drive growth.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And imagination and being able to manage your own resources and sales teams are two great points. And when you talk about that, Victor, we did a study with Microsoft, and we asked executives, is external data important to you in your forecasting and plans? And certainly all organizations and all executives say, oh, certainly it is, right? We do think that external matters. However, we also then asked them if they actually incorporated in any kind of systematic way these external signals into their forecast and planning process. And we found that nearly 70% did not. Victor, what do you think the challenges are, or why that may be the case that we are a little more anecdotal and not quite as systematized in analyzing these external factors in the finance function across your customers?
There are a couple of things here. I think the way that we use external data is for a process that we call our LRP, long range planning, right? That is where it manifests itself more broadly. You have more intent in how you use that information. You make points about it, the state of the IT industry, the size of the IT market, if you will, the intent of IT spend, and so on and so, economic conditions, inflation, political environment. These are things that you are more overt when discussing a long-range planning. The challenge when you go downstream to an area or a subsidiary is that it almost becomes too big to manage if you don't have the right setup, right? I mean, I think for it to be successful, you probably need to have a solution that, while incorporating external data like that, it probably makes them part of the fabric of the process, of the forecasting process itself. We do use machine learning as an anchor in the way that we forecast now. We do use machine learning to inform our views of what the market is going to be 1, 2, 3 years down the road. it's not like the only the only data point that we take. We just don't blindly follow what an algorithm or artificial intelligence may say to us, but clearly it's a very important anchor point. And what we have found is that with the advent of technology in that way, you don't have to be thinking about all of those variables and how is that you're going to use them, or how are you going to run econometrics models and run your typical tests, if you will, to check for relevance, because it's just too unwieldy to do it like that. It's too complicated, and so I think that is the biggest challenge. If you don't have the right tools, it's very hard to incorporate that sort of information, data, context into the way that you're thinking about your business.
No, that makes great sense, and really that's the foundation of what we've built at Prevedere on the Microsoft Azure platform, is a way for all companies, those that aren't and don't have the technical capacity of a Microsoft or the knowledge of machine learning to incorporate. We've leveraged Microsoft technologies to bring that to every company. And Microsoft, we'll talk in a minute about a great use case of that at Microsoft. But before we do that, we've got a couple administrative things here. One, Victor mentioned the strategic planning and the long-range forecast, and that is a great place to start, certainly, in understanding where the markets are heading. What we have seen in this data divide is sometimes the internal technical team that may be building machine learning applications or creating some sort of predictive model can be very tactical, very in the weeds, trying to forecast one specific item in one specific small market. Where we found success, like Victor and team, is we do want to start at the strategic. What are things that really matter or drive the core of our business in major markets? And then we can use that to get more tactical or granular. So I thought that was a great point, Victor. The long-range planning is where to start. And then once you can start trusting and believing in these external factors, they become fabric of your forecast process. So very great points. From here, I would like to hand it back over to Joe to start our first poll question of the day.
Thank you so much, Rich and Victor. And indeed, we do want to pose our first of three polling questions before we talk about technology. Our first of three polling questions asks attendees to indicate the extent to which you agree or disagree with the following statement. And that statement is that external factors, as we've described, represent key components of your company's forecasting, planning, and decision-making processes. What attendees are welcome to do is select the radio button that corresponds to your answer. Then we ask that you click on these submit buttons so that we can record your response. From top to bottom, the choices are strongly agree, disagree, strongly disagree, or I don't know. After you've selected the radio button that corresponds to your answer, we do ask that you click on these submit buttons so that we can record the extent to which you agree or perhaps disagree with the statement that external factors, as we've defined them, represent key components of your company's forecasting, planning, and decision-making processes. What we'll do is give attendees just 1 or 2 more seconds to respond. We'll then briefly reveal and summarize how you've responded. And then what we will do is launch into a discussion about technology, applications of technology to address the divide that Rich so eloquently described. What we can see from among respondents to our first of three polling questions is that, and this is completely understandable, an overwhelming majority definitely agree. Indeed, more than 4 out of 5 respondents at the very least agree, and nearly a third strongly agree. Now, that's very interesting that attendees respond the way they do. So, with that in mind, what we now want to do is talk about applications of technology to address the data divide, and we will now launch into a discussion about this very topic.
Okay, I want to introduce a term that we're hearing in the market, and we're hearing from some of our large consulting partners, and it's what's called intelligent forecasting. And how they define intelligent forecasting is just what we were talking about as a group. It's the ability to systematically identify, quantify, and incorporate external factors into the forecast process. Now, many of them can be economic, but it can also be weather. It can be consumer behavior data, IoT data. Any of those factors that would make our forecast more informed is really what intelligent forecasting is. And with this in mind, in this concept, it's something that Microsoft also foresaw and has an initiative that Victor, I think, will be able to describe on their use of machine learning to improve their forecasting process.
Okay. So this is an example that I've had a chance to share with some of our customers. If you think about the way that we are configured as a company, we have a number of subsidiaries around the world. Those subsidiaries roll into areas, and the areas roll to worldwide, and you have a forecast by different kinds of business, commercial, consumer, etc. The problem with that, and I've lived through it most of my professional career here, is that at every layer of forecasting, you have a level of judgment, because invariably, sales leaders will use the forecast also to manage the business for political means, meaning they want to make a statement about their ability to grow or their confidence in tracking back to budget if they're behind, as examples that I gave before, right? And so this is a problem, because what you require is fidelity. You require to have the right forecast so that you can make at the highest level possible, in this case the CFO of the company, the right calls in front of Wall Street. And you cannot do that properly if at every layer of your forecasting process you have elements of judgment inserted in. Right? And so what we did, I want to say about 4 years ago, 3 years ago, perhaps even longer, is we started to use this concept of machine learning. And what it is, and I had this chat with some people already, it's machine learning for me is a huge econometric model that is almost like a black box in a way for people outside. It harnesses the power of computing at scale, and it harnesses the power of being able to ingest all sorts of data, structure or not structure, and without you or the user having to test for things, as I mentioned before. And we use the outcomes of machine learning, which get better over time, as a reference point. And so what has happened in our experience is that if you have a forecast from the field or a forecast from the engineering groups as it relates to revenue, we contrast them versus what the models say. And as I mentioned, it's not like you take the model blindly, because there might be elements that do require deeper inspection and discussion in the real world, but you will have to be hard-pressed to disagree with a model that has proven to be more consistently more accurate over time, and discussions are welcome. We have found that having a machine learning forecast solution as a guardrail to our business has improved our forecast accuracy and our ability to better guide results quarter in, quarter out with analysts.
Yeah, that's great, Victor. I think you mentioned a couple key things there. Is number one, this machine learning is an input to the forecast process, right? It's something that that cannot take over and become the forecast, because there are other sets of knowledge and information inside the organization that will inform the final forecast. So I thought that was a great point. The other point you mentioned was econometric. Econometric modeling has been around a long time, and it really is the ability to leverage micro and macroeconomic factors that are leading indicators of change for your business into the forecast process in some sort of a statistical model. And what's been found with the econometric models is that they are great predictors of future change in direction of your business. Maybe you've been growing at 3, 5, 10% for several years. An econometric model will actually catch ahead of internal historical trends a decline or a deceleration in your business. And that's a lot of what we do here at Prevedere, and it sounds like that's Victor's background as well, and leveraging these econometric models to inform or as a guardrail for the forecast. one other point to that, before we go further and talk about some examples, is he mentioned that having all this information can be overwhelming, and there's a lot of it, and it's hard for companies to grasp all the things they need to. Well, the power of machine learning and the power of cloud computing is you can collect all these signals, and mathematically and through algorithms, you could parse through them to find what are the right influencers of your business. And as Victor said, with consistency on accuracy, then they become part of the process. You become more confident in your forecast, and you'll receive better results going forward as an input. So a lot of what we do is build machine learning algorithms that combine what economists know, right, and what data scientists know, as well as what the company knows, into a predictive model, so we know not only what are the leading indicators, but when they'll impact your business and by how much. And that's kind of the key to getting a data-driven forecast and a data-driven plan in the organization. And from here, I'll hand it back to Joe for our second poll question.
Thank you very much, Rich. And indeed, this is the second of 3 polling questions. Now, we've established several things so far. First, we've established that although organizations may consider external factors when forecasting, planning, and making decisions, they do not necessarily do so in a systematic way. Hence, our second of 3 polling questions, which asks attendees to indicate the extent to which you agree with the statement that your company typically factors in, and we've distinguished now, leading external economic indicators when forecasting future results. What attendees are welcome to do is select the radio button that corresponds to your answer, and then click on the submit button so that we can record your response. From top to bottom, the choices, as with our first poll, are strongly agree, agree, disagree, strongly disagree, or I don't know. As with our first poll, after you select the radio button that corresponds to your answer, we do ask that you click on the submit button so that we can record your response to the question that your company, or to the level with which you agree or disagree with the statement, rather, that your company typically factors in leading external economic indicators when forecasting future results. We'll give attendees 1 more second to respond. We'll then reveal, as we did with our first poll, reveal and summarize how you have responded. So here I think we have a much more useful result in that we've now gotten more specific. Interesting that about 3 out of 4 respondents in this case, at the very least, agree the company typically factors in leading external economic indicators when forecasting future results. A very interesting response, but again, I think it's important to distinguish leading and lagging, and even more important, do so in a systematic way and deal with a number of factors. And with that in mind, we're now going to talk about the role of a data-driven organization. In particular, we're going to hear some real-world examples. So now I'm going to turn the floor back over to Rich.
So yeah, we're going to talk about some very specific examples of leveraging leading indicators and providing a fact-based, unbiased forecast for future demand or revenue and what the results were. So as we talked about with Victor, there's some guardrails. Why these are important is because unexpected headwinds can eat into profits. If we see that consumers are starting to slow, they're buying in stores and shift to online, well, we know we're going to have to manage our resources better, our working capital. We're going to staff differently at stores. We're going to stock differently. We have different schedules in different markets. We'll ship differently. The other side of the table, if we don't see growth in demand and future revenue opportunity, we leave money on the table. We may see that we did not spend enough in e-commerce, or a specific market may be growing, however, we did not ship enough inventory there. So unexpected headwinds will really eat into profits, as well as leaving money on the table is also an issue in what we call under-forecasting, right, or what everyone calls under-forecasting. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more in some specific examples of where that may have happened and how using leading external data, maybe changes in consumer sentiment or purchasing, interest rates, fluctuations, all those things can lead up to changes in your business. One that I'll talk about first is we worked with a large retailer that was growing quite well, one of the fastest growing retail companies in the United States for several years, seeing a 20% growth year over year in their products in their stores. What typically happens when we do our next year forecast and plan assumptions is most companies will assume that growth will continue, and most boards and most leaders will want that to continue. So we may forecast another 20% growth or somewhere around there. It may soften a little bit, but typically there aren't wild swings to that growth forecast because we all want that to happen, and we all believe it can happen. However, in this case, we started seeing some changes in external factors and a very specific consumer demographic. And for this company, it was 18 to 34-year-old females were actually not getting the same raises as the rest of the rest of the demographic. So we could see that income for that demographic was kind of flat, and we also saw that consumer prices were increasing. So for this specific demographic, we saw a squeeze in consumer prices for things like gas and milk and dairy and insurance, rent were growing, and unlike other demographics, their real average hourly income was flat and it wasn't growing to compensate. This was a key buyer for this company and their product lines. The other thing that we saw was there was a shift from buying products in a specialty store to actually buying in convenience stores. As we partner with people like Nielsen for retail data, we could see changes in where they shopped. So this key demographic, that was telling us that not only was this company not going to grow at 20% next year because of these headwinds in their business, but actually we saw about an 8% decline from the previous year growth rate. What that meant was about a $300 million top-line revenue miss was coming. It was on the horizon. Luckily for this executive, the CFO and the CEO of this organization, they saw that ahead of time. They were able to make plans and start actually putting money in and working capital into their e-commerce platform, which was able to offset this slowing demographic because e-commerce was actually growing for their specific products and their specific markets. So an example of if we did nothing, we assume we're going to grow at 20% next year. Well, that's going to lead to not only a top-line revenue miss, but also a working capital issue with all the profits that we assume that would bring in. I'm going to shift for a minute to a manufacturing organization. This manufacturing organization had a business unit that was also growing quite well and a new product to market. And to give you an idea, this is a product that went into the energy, oil, and gas industry to help fill up fracking wells. So what this company was seeing was an increase in demand for several years, a very profitable growing business on a product they created, had an opportunity to either double down and continue investing in this product, in this division, or their private equity owners were looking, is it a time to sell this division? Are we at a peak? Well, their leading indicator in this case, in their mind, was how many wells were being drilled in the United States. And that indicator was telling them that, yes, there's still lots of wells being drilled. We think our business will continue to grow. What we found in analyzing after the fact, which happens a lot of times that we try to explain past results, is that that wasn't an actual leading indicator for this business. It was a coincidental indicator, meaning that it was happening at the same time. However, leading indicators through our engine and through data and analysis were offshore capacity. That was actually slowing. Underground capacity was growing, how much energy and oil and gas was stored. And that told us that not only was that company not going to grow, that in the next 18 months they were actually going into the lowest point they've ever had. Lo and behold, they held onto the business based on their coincidental indicator. Today, that business is about minus 20 million EBITDA. So in this case, in talking with the CEO, he said, think about the value destruction that happened because we didn't pay attention to the right leading indicators. So another very dramatic example to something a little more anecdotal. One other organization that we talked to, not being so specific on leading indicators, large regional sales manager said, you know what, I forecast my business on, it's when my knees hurt. Because when my knees hurt, I know it's going to rain, and when it rains, we sell less product. And that's how he would base his forecast for decades, right? He would look at the pond in the backyard, see if it was full, feels like it's going to rain. Well, I'm doing my forecast today. I'm actually going to say that we're not going to sell as much as before because of that. Well, that happens in organization. And I've found throughout my career and throughout the start of this company 7 years ago that forecasting can be a very naive process, right? We don't want these things to influence our forecast. Unfortunately, there's some bias sometimes in those. So that's some specific examples in my experience. Now what I want to do is go from examples and to talk about the role of the CFO and how it's changing. And with that, Victor, I kind of want to ask you, through your experience and your foresight, do you see the role of the CFO going forward changing in organizations? And if so, how do you see that changing?
Thank you, Rich. I think this is a very important topic for the function and for the role that finance organizations play in companies. Without a doubt, I think our responsibility is to steer our company towards in a more sustainable, aggressive growth path. I mentioned that the key function that I see as performing is driving the right resource allocation, and that's been a theme that has come out in many of the examples that you just shared. And that is actually what drives, I think, growth. I mean, sustainable growth happens when scarce resources are put to the best use possible. And for that, you require a lot of fortitude, courage, to have the right conversations within your company in order to make the right decisions. Because as we are aware, I mean, people invariably derive value or personal prestige from the size of their budgets, operating expenses budgets, for the size of the revenue that they manage. And while, this is the reality of the human condition, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the best allocation of resource for what the company needs to do over the long run. And I think it's a role in making sense out of the world, making sense out of the information that we have in our markets, in our company, in the economy where we operate, in the world, in order to drive those sort of decisions. Clearly for us, we had, like I said, a seminal moment when we decided to invest aggressively into the cloud and make a play there. And that requires also technical expertise, without a doubt. But the two are deeply intertwined. You could argue that over the past, I want to say, 5 to 7 years, that marriage has delivered over $1 trillion in market capitalization for our shareholders.
Yeah, and that's fantastic. And you mentioned having the courage, to use that information and to actually influence decisions, right? We know that there are times when decisions are made based on size of budget, as you mentioned, or headcount. How can we get past that as leaders within companies? I think a lot of that, in our experience, has to do with the belief in technology and the belief in the information that's being given. So one thing that we've done at Prevedere is we've combined technology and data with how people think, right? How the business leaders think about their business, how economists think about the economy and what affects certain markets. And by combining those three things, we're able to present back to CFOs like Victor and others with confidence something that they can and want to understand or consume. A black box approach to fend off maybe a business unit president who's asking for more budget just doesn't work. In our case, we have to be able to show and convince that business unit leader as well as the CFO that we're actually combining technology and economic and industry expertise to make better decisions. And that's a lot of what we've done is trying to get over that internal bias or desire to, build teams and increase your budget with some fact-based data that has really been powered by technology like Microsoft's. So this is more the how. How do we go from looking at internal historical only into something that can influence the CFO, can influence the business unit or the budget owner, that we are bringing the right information and to adjust their plans. And how we do that is leveraging lots of technology. It's technology agnostic, we say. We can work with any system, any company's data, from spreadsheets in Excel, which is still widely used to forecast and plan, to ERP or CPM or EPM solutions where we'll pull out data, leveraging the power of this cloud that Victor talks about and their progression to it with Steve Ballmer. We can now process information at pennies on the dollar compared to before. So we can take the world's data, we can compute it, we can take your internal historical, and then what we've done is we know we have to present it in ways that these decision makers, want to see and use consistently. And things like Power BI is a great tool for that, Tableau and others. So we've really leveraged the technology stack, and why we have Victor here today from Microsoft, as part of our solution. And when you do, the CFO that years ago did not leverage as much technology and data and reports actually starts to incorporate it into the process. They look for executive insights, functional insights, planning and forecasting input that they can consistently use.
I would say that this is very true. The deeper insights, the ability to present data in a way that is compelling and easy to consume is extremely important. At the same time, I want to emphasize that what is required from a CFO standpoint, or anyone in a position of leadership in finance, is to have the wherewithal and the courage to make the right calls. I think the two complement each other. Data and the ability to show data and to present it in a way that is easily consumable does not do the whole work. I think it's extremely important. Without it, we would be handicapped for sure. But you do require, as a finance leader, to have the courage to see things for what they are and speak truth to power when the moment comes.
Yeah, that's a great point, Victor. The people, process, and technology conundrum, right?
Okay.
It's technology we can change, we can implement, but we also need to be able to influence people and the change process in organizations. So I think that's a great point. The other thing that we've seen is once we can convince these leaders and these CFOs this is a must-have critical input to their forecast, the neat thing that we can do in today's world is we can make it live in real time. And I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar that the world is changing faster than ever before. Every day, news comes out. There could be a political tweet storm. There could be some sort of event, a hurricane or weather across the globe. And really what we need to be able to do is technical solution providers is to ensure that we're providing real-time information to our CFOs. And part of what we do is create an economic baseline forecast, certainly for organizations at certain levels in their organization. And then we have a monitoring system that will actually alert you when there's a change externally that's going to impact your plans. And with that, I wanted to pose a question to Victor that we touched on earlier. When CFOs are looking to embrace this journey of leveraging technology and external data and make some strategic decisions based on it. In your case, for example, where did you start? Was it a specific business unit, a specific product category, region? What really got you started on this journey?
That's a great question. I think there is, I don't know that there is science about it, but there are there are some milestones, or there is an approach that I think has worked best for us. In any transformation of this magnitude, like if you're changing significantly the way that you're forecasting, you got to start with a lot of focus, at least in our experience, in some specific areas. You gotta. So what we've done is we didn't institutionalize or mandate it. Everyone is going to use in machine learning models to do forecasting, but we started at, if I recall correctly, I think it was a consumer business, some of our hardware business, because there are a number of metrics that sometimes are difficult to grasp manually. That's where we started, and we started to correlate it so that you start to show to the rest of the organization the benefits and the power of that particular solution. That's one thing. So we started with a lot of focus, and I'm not trying to make it a rule or a mandate, but that's the way that we began our journey here. The second one is that I think is equally important. Is to make sure that you handpicked or choose the people who are going to lead this effort carefully. It's rewarding risk takers. There are people who, invariably in any organization are a little bit more conservative than others, and so you need to be aware of that. And people who are too vested in certain ways of doing things are probably not going to be helpful either. And this is not through no fault of their own, or, I'm not judging. It's just, you find people at different stages of their career or in how they are looking at things, and it's important that we pick the right people, curious, innovative, and hungry for change as the leaders of a change like this one. And so that's what we did as well. We handpicked a few people, we put them on the project, and little by little we started to build from there. And then it does require, I would say finally, the broad support of the higher levels of the organization. In our case, it was from Amy, where she basically said, I'm not going to have a forecast discussion that does not include a solution that is for a machine learning forecast, right? And if it's wrong, I want to understand why, and we got to get better over time, because success is not guaranteed in the first pass. And like what we found over the quarters is that our models, our algorithms got better and better over time, because the more data you give them, the more insights and the more foresights they're able to provide to you. And so if you look at us, 18, 20 quarters ago, and look at us now, it's a completely different scenario where it's being far more widely adopted across all businesses. And like you probably are aware, we range from consumer hardware businesses, from Xbox to Surface devices to Azure and Office 365, and we are using them across the board.
Yeah, Victor, you pointed out some great things there, and I wanted to try and summarize. Number one, start focused. Focused in this case was the consumer line. A large business, yes, had lots of variables externally, and was worth solving, obviously. Secondly, which I thought was very appropriate, is reward risk takers. So often we introduce change, we get some reservation from individuals that are just used to doing the same thing the same way and aren't quite the risk taker. But forming a team and rewarding was absolutely essential. It sounds, and it is essential in our enterprise customers that adopt. And the last one was the support of Amy Hood, your CFO, and saying, hey, we are going to do this, but we know that almost like wine, it gets better over time, right? The more we test and learn, to tell you the truth, the more we fail, eventually we'll succeed. So we didn't pull the plug, or Microsoft, it sounds like, realized that it wasn't an immediate success, didn't mean it was an immediate failure. And I thought those three things were really great points. Victor. And then as I shift into, well, what's that mean to us? what if we can improve our forecast and improve our decisions? What will it mean to the bottom line? What will it mean to the top line? So in most cases, we all kind of generally know that a more accurate forecast means we make better plans. We staff correctly, we price correctly, we go on the right markets at the right time, and we get out. We take advantage of market opportunity and increase top-line revenue. Studies have shown that companies that are analytically savvy and use leading indicators can increase top line by up to 8% more than competitors, while reducing cost, such as excess and obsolete inventory, incorrect marketing spend in different areas, warehousing and logistics costs at the same time. So there's a huge advantage. And someone like Microsoft, and I thought Amy's story and yours that you guys share about machine learning and what it did to your forecastability was very important to realize. For every 1% improvement in forecast, there's lots to be gained. In the case of Microsoft, I read one of the stories about the machine learning initiative and said, we were improving forecast by 1.3%. That may not sound like a lot, and it may seem like, well, was it really worth that much effort? But when you look at revenue in a company like Microsoft, that's worth about $1.6 billion in revenue.
That is correct.
Yeah. Profitability or gross margins off of that, if that's 36 or so percent for Microsoft, it's hundreds of millions of dollars for every 1%. So if we can actually help companies in some cases go 8% or reduce costs by 10, we know it's worth quite an investment and the time it takes to implement and allow it to improve and get better. And it is something that McKinsey and others that we worked with, we know that we continually have to test these assumptions. As Victor mentioned, it did get better over time. It wasn't a knee-jerk reaction, does it work or does it not work, and then stop. It's more input data, more training, more situations externally. We'll get smarter and better about what are the things that we need to incorporate into our forecasting process. Well, that leads me to a conclusion here and then questions and answers. A quick summary of steps that I heard from Victor and we've seen in our companies that seem to make the most success. How do we get started? One, start with things that matter, major business units, major product categories, and major markets. That will influence your decision makers above that to continue to move forward and give you enough information about what drives your business to also take it more granular. You will need to identify your unique set of leading indicators. Every company is different. You work in different markets, have different end-use products. You will need something that can test lots of variables, lots of assumptions, and come back with the right set. And then as you do that, you want to really generate objective business outlooks, unbiased outlooks on current economic conditions, and then provide that or empower your executives with that information so that they can make smarter, more proactive decisions, incorporating that into every forecasting and planning session, whether it's annual planning, quarterly, a rolling monthly financial forecast, or S&OP meeting. So those are the steps that we've seen most take. Those are the things it sounds like Microsoft has went through successfully. And from that, I'm going to say thank you, Victor, for spending time with me today and sharing Microsoft's story.
Thank you very much, Rich.
Well, thank you so much, Rich and Victor. And indeed, we do want to pose a third of our three polling questions. And I think we have time for one great question, by the way, from an attendee. But first, we do want to pose our third of three polling questions. And we want to find out within what time frame, if any, your company intends to incorporate leading external economic indicators, including, but not limited to, consumer confidence and demographics, just by way of example, combined with predictive analytics and machine learning within your forecasting and planning processes. So what we ask attendees to do is select the radio button that reflects your answer and then click on the submit button so we can record your response from top to bottom. The choices are my company has already done so this year, next year, my company does not intend to do so. or I don't know. And after you select the radio button that reflects your answer, we do ask that you click on the submit button so that we can record the time frame, if any, in which your company intends to incorporate leading external economic indicators, including, but not limited to, consumer confidence and demographics, combined with predictive analytics and machine learning within forecasting and planning processes. And what we can see, just briefly, before we pose a quick question that an attendee has shared with us, what we can see is that this is definitely on attendees' radar. I think that this is an opportunity for those who don't know, to consider what they need to learn about applying econometrics and predictive analytics and machine learning to applying leading economic indicators, external indicators, that is, to forecasting, planning, and decision-making. And as I said, we do have time for one great question from an attendee, and that is, I think, Rich, you'd be great to answer this. With regard to the approach you've described, an attendee asks, Rich, what systems and processes does one use to ensure management is engaged and the approach is dynamic? Rich, what would you advise given the type of approach that you have discussed during our webinar today?
Yeah, I think the thing that we see works the best is when we partner with the executive team to do what we call a proof of value. In a concept of as large as what we do, we want to engage the executives up front and say we're looking to identify external drivers, improve this process. Can you provide us some insight on what you feel drives the business? They'll give us great information, and then we can go off and use our technology, which is a repository of global data, algorithms in Microsoft's cloud, to really validate some of the things that the executives told us, as well as uncover some hidden things that maybe they didn't know or hasn't seen. And then we really have to get back in front of that executive team on that first discovery session and say, here's what we found. Does it make sense? And then show them if they would have used it last year, last quarter, last month, how accurate would have this external forecast been? That's where we see it makes win is engaged with, not just use technology off on our own, but make sure we do an initial discovery, run the engine that we have, find great insights, present those insights to get business buy-in.
That's a wonderful approach, Rich, and I do want to acknowledge we've received some great additional questions from attendees. We may not have had the opportunity to address all. We will plan to follow up on any remaining questions after our webinar. In the meantime, just want to, in addition to thanking our distinguished guests, want to let attendees know what will follow from our webinar and also display some relevant contact info as well. This webinar will be available on demand within the past webinar section of CFO.com later this week. At that point, you'll be able to view and listen to a streaming archive of our webinar, download a PDF document comprising slides, click on links to view information about upcoming events that offer the opportunity to hear from and meet finance leaders in person. And if you've responded to all three polling questions during our live webinar, retrieve your CPE certificate. At the very end of our webinar, we will invite attendees to complete an online feedback survey, and that will appear in a separate browser window that you will be able to view if you turned off your pop-up blocker within your web browser. As always, we appreciate your feedback. Once again, want to thank our distinguished guests, Victor from Microsoft and, of course, Rich from Prevedere. And we thank attendees for joining us for our webinar. The CFO Journey, How to Use Economic Intelligence to Maximize Shareholder Value, brought to you by Argyle, the publisher of CFO Magazine and CFO.com, and sponsored by Prevedere. We thank you for your time, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.